Even silence carries intention. And far too often people misinterpret silence as absence, when in fact it's a form of presence that speaks louder than words. The one who pretends not to see you, the one who acts like they've moved on, like they are unaffected, like you don't exist in their world anymore, they are watching. Always watching. Not because they are obsessed, but because energy doesn't lie. Connection doesn't disappear just because it's denied. And when something meaningful touches the soul, it leaves a mark that cannot be erased just by ignoring it. We live in a world that values loud expressions, overt gestures, and visible attention. People assume that if someone isn't texting, calling, showing up, or liking their pictures, they're no longer interested. But that's not how the deeper layers of life work. Some people will pretend they're indifferent simply because their pride won't allow them to be vulnerable. Their ego becomes the mask they wear to shield their curiosity, their pain, their regret. But behind that mask, behind the nonchalant words and distant actions, there's a gaze fixed on you. A gaze that studies your moves, watches your growth, notices your silence. He may not say a word, but he's reading everything you post, remembering everything you said, and revisiting every moment in his mind like it just happened yesterday. And you may wonder, why doesn't he say anything then? Why pretend not to care? Why act like nothing happened? Because sometimes watching from afar is safer than engaging directly. Some men cannot confront the emotional storm they helped create. Some are paralyzed by guilt, fear, or the thought of losing control. So they sit in the shadows, pretending not to see you while their entire being is tuned in to your presence. He might scroll past your name, skip your messages, or pretend to be over it, but in the quiet corners of the day when no one's watching him, he's watching you. You must understand this deeply. A man's silence is not always detachment. Sometimes it is conflict. A battle between wanting to reach out and refusing to surrender to the emotions he's tried to bury. When you triggered something deep in someone, when your presence awakened something they weren't ready to confront, they will often withdraw, not because they don't care, but because they care too much and don't know how to handle it. So they run, they act, they perform, they pretend, but pretending doesn't erase the truth. The truth lingers. The truth watches. The truth watches. The truth remembers. Your energy, your essence, your growth. It creates a vibration that cannot be hidden. And that vibration doesn't go unnoticed. You don't need to speak, beg, or prove anything to be acknowledged. The very act of you rising, of you healing, of you walking with quiet confidence is being watched. He sees the transformation. He sees the strength. He sees the joy returning to your face. And though he may never admit it, that image stays with him. It replays in his mind. The silence between you is filled with thoughts, with memories, with internal conversations he's too proud to have out loud. What most people don't realize is that watching is often the final form of control. He pretends not to see you because acknowledging you would mean acknowledging the feelings he tried to suppress. If he engages, he risks reopening wounds, reliving shame, or realizing how deeply he lost something valuable. So he chooses silence as his armor. But inside that armor is a man who is alert, reactive, and tuned into your frequency. You are not forgotten. You are not invisible. You are just too powerful to be approached without preparation. And some people would rather avoid you than face the truth of who you've become. And while you may be tempted to internalize his silence as rejection, don't. Don't take his pretending as the final verdict. Understand the psychology behind it. Understand that some men were never taught how to process regret, how to apologize, or how to show up authentically after they've caused pain. So they become watchers, spectators of the very life they once had access to. They observe from a distance what they once held close. And that observation can last months, years, or even a lifetime. You are the subject of a silent movie playing in his head. He rewinds it often, sometimes late at night, sometimes when he's alone and no one's asking what's on his mind. And every time he sees you smile, achieve, elevate, or radiate peace, he notices. Every time you don't chase, don't reach out, don't crumble, he watches. Noticing your evolution, but never announcing it, because he can't. Not yet. Not when the ego is still too loud and the emotions are still too raw. So he pretends. He acts. But every action he takes is informed by what you're doing, even if it's just breathing silently in your power. He may act like you're not on his radar, but you are. He may act like you're irrelevant, but he watches how others respond to you now. He notices who comments, who likes, who shows up for you. He watches the spaces you occupy and the way you carry yourself now, light, free, unbothered. And even if he says nothing, your image still lives in the quiet corners of his awareness. Not because he chose it, but because some energies never leave. Some bonds are felt long after they've been broken. Some connections are so deep, they echo even through silence. When someone pretends they're not watching, when they pull back and create distance, it often triggers a wave of emotions inside of you: confusion, sadness, frustration, sometimes even anger. You start asking yourself, what did I do wrong? You overanalyze every interaction, every word you said, every moment shared. But here's the truth. What you're experiencing is not always rejection. It's a test. It's a form of emotional detachment designed to provoke a response, not necessarily to end the connection. And in many cases, it's not even about you. It's about their inability to handle what they feel when they're around you. People often create emotional space not because they want to leave, but because they don't know how to stay without being exposed. Your presence, your energy, your growth, your emotional intelligence, it may intimidate someone who isn't ready to meet you at that level. So instead of rising to meet you, they retreat. They pull back, thinking they are protecting themselves, thinking they're regaining power. But in doing so, they begin a game they don't fully understand. They think that pulling away will make you chase. They think their silence will make you question your worth. And that's where many people fall into the trap. Taking someone else's emotional detachment and labeling it as personal failure. You must understand this deeply. When someone creates distance, it is not your job to close that gap by shrinking yourself, by begging, or by explaining your value. Their detachment is often an invitation for you to elevate, to recenter, to remember that you were whole before they arrived. The pain you feel is not because they left. The pain comes from the story your mind begins to write when they did. A story of not being good enough, of being forgotten, of being easily replaced. But those are not truths. They're narratives created by a wounded ego searching for validation. Detachment hurts, not because of the act itself, but because of the meaning we attach to it. This is where emotional mastery becomes essential. If you want to overcome the negative feelings that show up when someone pretends they're unbothered or uninterested, you must first stop internalizing their behavior as a reflection of your value. Let their silence speak for them. Let their absence create space for you, not despair. Because not every person who distances themselves is leaving you. Some are simply trying to find the courage to face themselves. And unfortunately, some people will never return, not because you were unworthy, but because your presence demanded a level of truth they weren't ready to give. When you begin to understand detachment as a test, you stop reacting and start observing. You see the patterns clearly. You no longer take the bait. You begin to realize that some people want to see if you will break, if you will chase, if you will compromise your dignity just to feel seen again. And when you don't, when you remain still, grounded, and in alignment with your worth, you pass that test, not for them, but for yourself. You become the one who chooses peace over performance, strength over desperation. It's important to also understand that some people use detachment as a form of emotional manipulation. They withdraw affection, communication, and presence as a way to create control. It's subtle. It's passive. It's psychological warfare masked as emotional independence. And if you're not aware, you'll start to shrink, to question, to lower your standards just to get back the connection that once felt safe. But the truth is, any connection that makes you abandon yourself to maintain it is not love. It's bondage. And no one is worth losing your sense of self. You've got to reach a point where someone's silence doesn't silence your power, where someone's emotional games don't rob you of your peace, where someone's pretending doesn't make you forget who you really are. Detachment is only powerful if you give it power. And the moment you realize that, everything changes. You stop chasing, you stop explaining, you stop waiting, you start healing. You start growing. You start attracting a different energy, not by force, but by flow. This is how you overcome the negative feelings that come from detachment, by choosing to see it for what it is: a mirror, a test, a moment of truth, not a definition of your value. You take their distance and use it as space for reflection. You don't panic when they stop calling. You don't collapse when they stop showing up. You don't beg them to see you. Instead, you ask yourself, what am I being prepared for? Because every detachment, every silence, every act of pretending is preparing you to become someone who no longer depends on external validation to feel whole. People pretend not to care as a shield. They put on an act because they are afraid that real feelings will unravel their control. So they test you, not always out of cruelty, but out of fear, out of confusion, out of past trauma. But your healing is not their responsibility. Your peace is not tied to their presence. The moment they begin to play the detachment game, you step back, not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Because you know that love, real love, doesn't hide behind pretending. It doesn't test through absence. It doesn't use silence as punishment. Your emotions will try to drag you into the spiral of self-doubt when someone detaches. That's natural. But your job is to remind yourself that no matter who leaves, no matter who withdraws, no matter who pretends, you are still enough. You are still seen. You are still growing. You are still becoming. And nothing they do can alter the truth of who you are unless you allow it. There is a hidden power in observing without reacting. When someone pulls away, gives you silence, or pretends they're unbothered, it often lights a fire of confusion inside of you. Your mind races to make sense of their distance. You begin filling in the gaps of communication with assumptions. And most of those assumptions come from a place of insecurity. You start to believe that their silence means You're not important. You take their withdrawal personally, even when it has nothing to do with you. This is where the storm begins, not outside of you, but within. And if you don't learn to master this inner space, you will constantly be manipulated by the behavior of others, living as a prisoner to their moods, their inconsistencies, their lack of clarity. But something transformative happens when you stop chasing answers. When you choose stillness over reaction, something inside you begins to shift. You begin to reclaim the power you've been giving away. Because every time you rush to explain, to plead, to clarify, you're trying to earn a place in someone's life who is too confused to see your value. And that is emotional slavery, constantly trying to prove yourself to someone who is committed to misunderstanding you, not because you're unworthy, but because they are too emotionally immature to handle someone who doesn't beg for crumbs. When someone pretends they're not watching, it's often a test to see how much you're willing to devalue yourself for their attention. It's a test to see how quickly you'll abandon your peace to satisfy their ego. Some people find power in making others emotionally unstable. They retreat not because they're done, but because they want to control the pace of your emotional response. They want to see if you'll spiral without them. They want to feel wanted without the responsibility of reciprocating. So they give just enough to keep you hoping, but never enough to give you peace. That's not love. That's not respect. That's emotional warfare. And your silence becomes your strength when you understand this. When you stop reacting, when you stop explaining, when you stop chasing closure, you create an atmosphere of power. You become an emotional mirror, reflecting the energy back instead of absorbing it. You begin to realize that some people pretend they don't care because they are terrified that they do. They are afraid that acknowledging their emotions makes them vulnerable. So instead, they create emotional distance and wait to see what you'll do. They test your need for validation. They push boundaries not because they want distance, but because they want confirmation that you'll still be there when they return. But here's the catch. People who play that game often don't respect the ones who stay no matter what. They test loyalty not to honor it, but to exploit it. So you must become rooted. You must anchor yourself so deeply in your worth that silence no longer feels like abandonment, but like space for alignment. You must teach yourself that someone pulling away is not your cue to run after them. It's your cue to stand still and observe, to lean into the discomfort, not to relieve it by reaching out, but to understand it. Where does your panic come from? Why does their silence hurt you so deeply? What wound is being touched in those moments of uncertainty? Because more often than not, their withdrawal triggers an older story, a childhood fear of being ignored, an early betrayal, a deep longing to be chosen. But healing doesn't happen through people who trigger your wounds and leave you bleeding. Healing happens when you finally stop trying to convince others to see your worth and start showing yourself that you already have it. So when you practice emotional non-reaction, you begin to experience a new kind of freedom. You realize that people can disappear, go silent, pretend not to care, and you'll still be whole. You'll still wake up with purpose. You'll still show up for your life. You'll still be you. That's power. That's strength. That's maturity. And the people who play games, who use detachment as manipulation, they begin to feel that shift. They realize their silence no longer disturbs you. Their distance no longer controls you. And in that moment, the dynamic changes. You're no longer dancing to the rhythm of their emotional immaturity. You're creating your own beat. One rooted in self-awareness and peace. People may pretend not to care. They may pretend to have moved on. But pretending is not the same as peace. True peace doesn't need to pretend. And you'll know the difference because you've walked through the fire of silence and didn't burn. You held yourself through the ache of not knowing and didn't break. You stood still while the people you cared about tested your value, and you didn't lower your price. That is the kind of strength no one can fake. And it's the kind of energy that makes people realize they cannot play with your heart anymore. You don't need to respond to every withdrawal. You don't need to chase down every unanswered question. You don't need to write paragraphs to people who gave you silence. You don't need to defend your worth to someone who already knew your value but chose to ignore it. Your stillness becomes the loudest message. It says, I see what you're doing, but I will not dance with dysfunction. I will not beg to be seen. I will not perform to be chosen. That is where you break free. Not by fighting for attention, but by realizing you never needed it in the first place. You needed clarity. You needed truth. You needed real. And anything that isn't those things, you now have the strength to walk away from. Even if it once felt like home. There is a subtle yet powerful shift that occurs when you stop tying your value to someone's recognition of it. Most people are silently waiting for applause that may never come, waiting for someone to validate them, appreciate them, or even just notice them. They pour their heart into relationships, conversations, and connections, hoping the other person will see the depth of who they are and respond accordingly. But when that response doesn't come, when he acts like he doesn't see you, when he pretends you don't exist or that your presence is easily replaceable, it can feel like rejection. And rejection, when internalized, breeds a storm of negative emotions. Shame, sadness, anger, confusion. Not because you're actually unworthy, but because your sense of self was entangled in someone else's perception. But here's the truth. You cannot beg someone into seeing your worth. You cannot force appreciation out of someone who is emotionally blind or worse, emotionally manipulative. When someone pretends not to notice you, it is not always because you lack something. Sometimes it's because acknowledging your light would require them to confront their own darkness. It would require them to elevate. It would require them to match the effort, the honesty, the consistency you bring. And some people are not ready to do that. So they pretend not to see you because to see you clearly would mean to either rise or admit their inability to meet you where you are. This is where the danger of false narratives begins. When someone ignores you, withdraws from you, or acts indifferent, you might start creating stories in your head to explain their behavior. Maybe I wasn't good enough. Maybe I said too much. Maybe I loved too hard. These thoughts spiral quickly, creating emotional chaos that has little to do with truth and everything to do with fear. But what if the truth is not that you were too much, but that you were just too awake for someone who thrives in confusion? What if the real issue isn't that you cared too much, but that you were willing to be real in a world that rewards pretending? The more you begin to separate your value from someone's acknowledgement, the more free you become. You stop shrinking to fit their comfort. You stop silencing yourself just to avoid the tension of their silence. You stop abandoning your needs just to preserve their ego. You stop apologizing for being available, for being consistent, for being whole. You stop performing for people who have already decided they don't want to see the show. And in doing so, you start standing tall in your own truth. Unshaken, unbothered, and undeterred. The dangerous game some people play is pretending not to care while watching you closely. They pretend to be detached while silently hoping you'll chase. They say nothing while waiting for you to break the silence. They give distance not because they want space, but because they want control. They want to be the one you revolve around, not because they admire you, but because your attention validates them. So they withhold affection. They delay replies. They avoid honesty. They stay just enough to keep your hope alive, but not enough to give you clarity. This keeps you in emotional limbo, constantly reaching, constantly wondering, constantly doubting your own instincts. But clarity doesn't come from chasing it. Clarity comes when you stop looking for it in someone who is committed to being unclear. The truth you need is not in their actions, it's in your reaction to their inconsistency. The discomfort you feel is not just about them ignoring you. It's about the part of you that still believes your worth is negotiable, and it is not. Your value is not up for discussion. It is not dependent on someone else's readiness. It is not conditional upon being seen, validated, or chosen. You are whole, whether someone acknowledges it or not. You must learn to sit in the discomfort of not being seen by the person you thought would recognize you. You must learn to breathe through the ache of being overlooked without questioning your brilliance. You must walk away from the person who pretends not to care, not with bitterness, but with power. Because the ability to not chase, to not argue, to not prove is a strength very few have. It means you've matured past the point of performance. It means you've found home within yourself. When you no longer need someone's attention to feel seen, you begin to attract people who see you without being asked. When you no longer seek validation from someone pretending to be indifferent, you make space for those who are emotionally present. But this can only happen when you stop interpreting silence as a reflection of your value and start seeing it as a reflection of their fear. Some people cannot meet you in your depth, so they pretend it doesn't exist. They play indifferent not because they are, but because they can't match your intensity. And you must stop giving power to that. You must stop editing your presence to fit their blindness. You must stop writing chapters in a story where the other character refuses to show up. You must stop confusing their silence with evidence and begin reading it as avoidance. You are not too much. You are not invisible. You are simply too real for someone who is not ready to see themselves in your mirror. And that is not your fault. That is not your failure. That is their limitation. When you stop tying your worth to their recognition, you free yourself from the prison of performance. You no longer live for their attention. You live for your own truth. And that is where real peace begins. There is an inner war that erupts inside you when you give your energy to someone who doesn't respect it. It starts small, almost unnoticeable. A flicker of confusion when they take hours or days to respond. A tightness in your chest when they suddenly go cold without explanation. An uneasiness in your gut when their words don't match their actions. You try to rationalize it. You tell yourself they're just busy. You convince yourself you're overreacting. You make excuses for their silence, their distance, their inconsistencies. But over time, the flicker becomes a flame, and the flame becomes a fire that begins to burn away your peace. You feel it every time you reach out and they respond with indifference. You feel it when you open up and they close off. You feel it when your effort is met with silence, when your vulnerability is met with avoidance. And slowly, you start to question your instincts. You start to wonder if maybe it's your fault. Maybe you're too sensitive. Maybe you expect too much. Maybe you're the problem. That self-doubt becomes poison. It eats away at your self-respect, your self-trust, your self-worth. You start ignoring the voice inside you that says something isn't right. And instead, you follow the voice that says, if I just love them better, they'll change. But the truth is, giving your energy to someone who does not honor it is a betrayal, not just of your standards, but of your spirit. Because your energy is sacred, your attention is sacred, your heart is sacred. And when you give it to someone who doesn't handle it with care, who only receives it when it's convenient, who only shows up when they want something, you begin to trade your emotional currency for breadcrumbs. You settle for crumbs of communication, crumbs of affection, crumbs of validation, just enough to keep you hoping, but never enough to feel secure. This creates a cycle. You pour out more, hoping it'll make them care. You give more, hoping they'll notice. You shrink yourself, hoping they'll feel more comfortable. You adjust your needs, your emotions, your voice, all in the name of not losing them. But the truth is, if someone's presence in your life requires you to abandon yourself, then you're not keeping them. You're losing you. And no relationship, no connection, no bond is worth the price of your peace. People who are not ready to receive your energy will always find a way to misuse it. They'll take it for granted. They'll treat it like it's disposable. They'll dismiss it when it's convenient and pick it back up when they're lonely. And if you let them, they will keep you on a loop, feeding you just enough attention to keep you waiting, but never enough to truly fulfill you. That loop becomes your prison. You live in anticipation, always hoping, always waiting, always doubting. And let's be honest, that kind of emotional inconsistency is exhausting. It drains you. It clouds your focus. It keeps you tethered to someone who is not emotionally present, who is not emotionally honest, who is not emotionally safe. And the longer you stay, the more you start to think that chaos is normal, that confusion is love, that pain is just part of the process. But that is not love. That is emotional starvation disguised as affection. That is manipulation disguised as mystery. That is neglect disguised as independence. Your energy is not meant to be scattered, chased, or begged to be seen. It's meant to flow where it is received, where it is respected, where it is reciprocated. You are not created to pour endlessly into people who treat your effort like an option. You are not designed to chase love, affection, or attention. You are designed to radiate. And the people who are meant for you will be drawn to your light. Not blinded by it, not threatened by it, and certainly not indifferent to it. When you keep giving to someone who is emotionally unavailable, you are not being loyal. You are abandoning your own emotional truth. Loyalty is not about how much pain you can endure from someone else. Loyalty is about standing by your standards, your boundaries, your inner peace. It's about having the courage to say, I love you, but I love myself more. It's about recognizing that some people are only in your life to teach you how to stop overgiving. And once that lesson is learned, it's your responsibility to apply it. Not just in your words, but in your actions. That might mean walking away from someone who never really held space for you. That might mean cutting ties with someone who only showed up when they needed something. That might mean letting go of the fantasy you built in your mind about who they could be and accepting the reality of who they are. Because if someone can consistently mistreat your energy, they are not confused. They are not lost. They are not going through something. They are showing you who they are. And it's your job to believe them. And the more you continue to give to someone who does not reciprocate, the more you teach yourself that your energy is unworthy of respect. And the more you teach others that you'll tolerate being overlooked, used, or taken for granted. But when you start protecting your energy, something powerful happens. You become magnetic. You stop chasing and you start attracting. You stop seeking validation and you start living in alignment. You stop explaining your worth and you start embodying it. And that embodiment is what changes everything. Because when you stand in the fullness of your energy, unapologetic, unbothered, and unwavering, you don't need to prove your value. You become the proof. You become the example of someone who knows their power, who honors their soul, who no longer feeds what does not feed them. And in that place, your energy becomes untouchable, not because you're guarded, but because you finally learn to give only where it is received with grace and with gratitude. There comes a point in life when silence becomes the most powerful language you can speak. When someone tries to manipulate your emotions, they expect a reaction. They want to see you fall apart, chase after them, beg for their attention, or question your own worth just to make sense of their withdrawal. But the moment you go silent, not in defeat, but in strength, you flip the dynamic. Silence, when chosen deliberately, is not a retreat. It's a recalibration of your energy. It's a declaration that you will no longer argue with someone who already decided to misunderstand you. You will no longer dance to the rhythm of their inconsistency. You will no longer extend explanations to someone who plays deaf just to control the conversation. When a man pretends he's not watching you, when he keeps his distance and tries to mask his curiosity with apathy, your silence disrupts his game. He expected noise, tears, confusion, messages, overthinking, but silence tells a different story. Silence forces reflection. Silence makes him confront what he tried to avoid. You see, many people operate from a place of ego. They want to feel pursued, desired, chased. They withdraw, not because they lack interest, but because they crave power. So they stay quiet, withholding attention to see how deeply you'll crave theirs. But when you respond with silence, you take the bait out of the trap. You step away from the emotional chessboard and refuse to play a game that only benefits their ego. That's when the game starts to turn. People don't expect strength in stillness. They assume silence equals weakness. But in reality, silence is where your power grows. It's where your intuition sharpens. It's where you begin to hear your own voice again, without interference, without pressure, without manipulation. In silence, you begin to remember who you were before you questioned yourself to fit into someone else's storyline. You begin to regain your clarity, your sense of direction, your inner stability. You realize you don't need to chase someone who hides their interests behind emotional walls. You don't need to over-explain your worth to someone who pretends not to see it. You just need to be still enough to hear the truth your spirit has been whispering all along. And here's the paradox. When you finally go quiet, that's when they hear you the loudest. That's when the silence starts screaming at them. That's when they start noticing your absence more than they ever valued your presence. They thought your energy was endless, that your love was unconditional, that your patience had no limits. But now it's gone. Now it's withheld. Now it's no longer available on demand. And the human ego, no matter how detached it pretends to be, doesn't like losing control. So he starts checking your stories, asking mutual friends, revisiting old conversations, looking for signs that he still matters to you. And the beauty is, he's watching. Even if he pretends he's not, he's watching closely. But this time, you're no longer performing. You're not updating your status to get his attention. You're not posting cryptic quotes hoping he'll notice. You're not dropping hints in conversations. You're not reacting. You're not participating in the game. That right there is the shift. That is when silence becomes your boundary. You no longer make announcements when you leave the room. You don't try to fix what he never wanted to understand. You let the silence speak. And you let him sit with what he created. You give him the gift of wondering. Wondering how he lost access to your heart, your time, your energy. Wondering why the person who always used to care suddenly stopped responding. Wondering why the power dynamic is no longer in his favor. That wondering, it speaks louder than words. But this isn't about revenge or control. This is about reclaiming your peace. This is about recognizing that you don't have to scream to be heard. You don't have to beg to be seen. You don't have to compete for attention with someone who chooses distance. You just have to master the art of stillness. Because when you're calm, you become unpredictable. When you're silent, you become powerful. When you no longer engage in cycles of reaction, you regain control, not over them, but over yourself. And that's the only control that ever truly matters. This silence isn't coldness, it's wisdom. It's maturity. It's the understanding that not everything requires a response. Not every emotional trigger deserves your energy. Not every person who ignores you is worth chasing. Some people only understand the value of your presence when they feel the weight of your absence. And they will feel it not because you announced your departure, but because you stopped showing up in ways they took for granted. Your silence becomes their mirror. It reflects their own immaturity, their emotional avoidance, their inability to match your depth. And if they're wise, it may become their wake-up call. But whether they change or not, you already have. The silence teaches you how to love yourself again. It teaches you how to stop explaining your worth and start embodying it. It teaches you how to sit with discomfort without rushing back into chaos just to feel wanted. It shows you that your power isn't in how loudly you fight for someone. It's in how gracefully you let go when you're no longer valued. And the one who pretended not to watch you, he'll start noticing the shift. He'll see you glowing in your silence. He'll feel the gravity of your peace. And the absence of your voice will say more than all your words ever could.